After calling for Christians to be transformed and renewed in our minds as sacrifices to God in our daily lives, he warns against pride and haughtiness creeping in Romans chapter 12. Good morning. This is Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisney, Illinois, with your thoughts for Wednesday. The Apostle Paul, although he was an apostle called by Jesus Christ and actually had traveled much of the known world as a missionary, he kept himself modest and humble. And he calls for the church that has been redeemed and rescued from sin not to think too highly of ourselves just because God has chosen us to be his followers. He says in Romans chapter 12 and verse 3, "For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith." Paul, first of all, speaks about the grace that had been given to him. We know that Saul of Tarsus, his previous life, he was a persecutor of the early church. It probably felt that he deserved some kind of punishment or judgment for his actions against Christians in the church. Jesus even said to him in Acts chapter 9, "Why are you persecuting me?" Pointing out that his actions against the church was actually a personal affront to Jesus Christ himself. But Paul points out that God's grace had been extended to him, not only to forgive his sin, but to place him in the New Testament church and to make him an apostle and a leader. So through this grace, this gift of God, he speaks to the entire congregation, calling for humility. He says in this verse, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Now, it's all too easy for us to get an elevated opinion of ourselves, even sometimes in the work of God. Perhaps we think our status as forgiven actually makes us a step above others around us. It is actually man's nature and the sin of this world. It's called the pride of life. It makes us think very highly of ourselves and maybe even to seek to glorify ourselves above those around us. The danger is thinking more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. When we already think pretty highly of ourselves and we've already elevated that opinion of ourselves. So he calls for us to think soberly or evaluate ourselves sincerely. You realize the person who is under the influence may not think clearly. And I'm not even thinking of the influence of alcohol or drugs. I'm talking about the influence of pride and haughtiness in a person's life. If we were to see ourselves as God sees us, simply a sinner who has been saved by God's grace, snatched out of the grip of Satan, we would probably be able to think more soberly. He closes by clarifying this grace as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. The abilities and the knowledge that God has blessed us with should count. They should make a difference. Those things should make us responsible to do as God has called us to without that elevated view of ourselves. Instead, we should have a submitted, a humble spirit, realizing it is only by God's grace that we are where we are.